But again, my name is Amanda Quay Blount. I am very excited to be talking to you tonight about my very first published book, Meet Me at the Biltmore. So before I dive into sort of fun pictures and talking a little bit about my research, I just wanted to reiterate a little bit about myself. I am not a Rhode Island native, which I hope actually lended itself well to researching the Biltmore, because I had to start from scratch. I didn't have any family history with the hotel. I didn't have any great stories. Everyone else in the state does, I found out, but I did not. So I got to really start with a blank slate, which I think was really beneficial for me. I am a self-proclaimed history nerd. I absolutely love history. I have since I was a little girl. My grandmother and I traveled all over the place and mostly just did tours of old houses, castles, and hotels. So I really had it ingrained in my mind from a young age that the best stories are ones that can keep being retold. And so I was really excited to dig into these stories here in my new state, my new home state. My husband and I moved to Rhode Island in 2018. We had been living in Hawaii, but I'm from New Jersey originally, but my husband is a marine biologist, so we get to go to very exciting places in the world. So Hawaii to Rhode Island is a big shift. And when I first arrived here in Rhode Island, I didn't really know what way was up or what to even start with or how to plug in. And my father actually called me and said, "Oh, you're in Providence. You have to go check out this really cool historic hotel downtown." And my dad's a musician, and he said, "Oh, all the big bands over the past 100 years have played at this hotel. Like, everybody played there. Frank Sinatra played there. Count Basie played there. You have to go check out the Biltmore." And I said, "Okay, well, great, I'll go check out the Biltmore." By the time I got around to checking out the Biltmore was a week before they closed for renovations. And they closed for renovations when the Graduate AJ Properties, who named it the Graduate, had bought it. And then they closed for a year and a half because of COVID. So I got in for one look at the hotel before it closed, and I was definitely hooked. I was so excited to get in there and see it. And then fast forward a little bit, and I was sitting on my couch. It was, let's see, October 2020. I'd been pretty much sitting on my couch for 6 months because we all had been trapped at home. And I had said to myself, "Man, I really would love to read a book about that old hotel." Because as I said, I've traveled quite a bit around the world, and I can almost always find a book about cool old buildings to read. And so I called the library, and they didn't have anything. And I called the Historic Society, and they didn't have anything. And I called the Preservation Society in Providence, and they didn't have anything. And it dawned on me that maybe there was nothing about the hotel that had been written, which was fairly exciting. So I thought, well, I can do some of my own research. I'm really stuck at home like everybody else. And that was 2 years ago, and here I am today. So that is a little bit of the backstory of how I became interested in the hotel. And then I'm going to actually tell you a little bit about that research process as I get started. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If I have any audio issues, or if there's any problems at all, just wave your hands or whatever. I'm usually good at spotting that I have Zoom issues, because I do use Zoom a lot at work. But if I miss it, or I just am really breaking up or something, let me know, or you can drop it in the chat. All right. Can everyone see my screen okay? It should be a kind of Art Deco black and gold. Yes. Okay, perfect. That's great. Great. So this is how, as I mentioned, I started my journey into researching the Biltmore Hotel, which has resulted in my book, which is released officially yesterday, which is called Meet Me at the Biltmore, 100 Years at Providence's Most Storied Hotel. So the Biltmore Hotel, as many of you know, is 100 years old this year. So when I found that out, that's something I could find out on Wikipedia. So that was fairly exciting because I didn't have to do a ton of research to find out that it had a very special birthday coming up. It also gave me a good motivational date to be finished any projects I started. I thought, all right, I've got until June 2022. I'm going to finish whatever I'm going to finish on its birthday. I didn't. Just a disclaimer, I did not finish my project in time, but I finished it this past summer, so pretty close. So what I found, oh, and let me add another COVID time, pandemic time caveat. I would have normally, in order to do research on any historic building, as many of you know, being a part of a preservation society, I would have gone to a library or gone to a university, and I would have checked out books. As you know, we could not do this in October 2020. And worse yet, there's only a few places in the state of Rhode Island, and in the world actually, that have access to the Providence Journal Historic Archives. And unfortunately, the public library is not one of them. They do not have the historic newspapers. They only have 1980 and forward. So this presented a conundrum for me. I didn't have access to historic newspapers, and I didn't have any books about the Biltmore because no one had written one yet. So I called the Community College of Rhode Island, and they were completely closed. Their campus was closed. They weren't having classes. They had very limited programs online. And so I didn't hear back from them for a while, but back and forth for a few months. Finally, I got in touch with someone and I said, I'm starting a project at an inopportune time to do research, I realized, but I need access to the Providence Journal Historic Archives because I'm trying to find out what happened at this old hotel in Providence. Well, the librarians were lovely, but alas, they could not open the building for me. There were very strict pandemic protocols. I wasn't allowed in the building, but they did, however, give me a password to log into their Wi-Fi from their parking lot. So I spent about 300 hours in my front seat of my car over the course of 18 months. Downloading PDFs from the historic Providence Journal Archives. I downloaded 14,000 articles over 300 hours in my car. And then I came home with all of my PDFs on my computer and I read them, most of them. I didn't really read 14,000 articles. And what I discovered over the course of these 2 years of research or 18 months of really reading all of these 14,000 historic articles, and not all of them were about the hotel. A lot of them just mentioned the hotel or something scandalous that happened outside of the hotel, like when one of the Astors got in a fist fight on the front steps of the hotel. It wasn't necessarily about the hotel, but that's kind of what makes up the history of the hotel, the people. That's essentially what I found. When I looked at the hotel and when I thought about it, what I quickly found was that the hotel was made up of the people who have lived there, because for more than half of the hotel's life, it also was an apartment building in addition to being a hotel. So many people actually lived there. And the people who have graced its stages and restaurants and entertained in its suites. So some of these faces you may recognize, others you may not, but if you read the book or you have a chance to read the book, you will quickly get to know all of these people very well. And this is just a small snapshot of some of the characters, criminals, entertainers, and families that have made up the Biltmore story over 100 years. To give you a sense of who some of these people are, the big family in the middle are the Von Trapp family singers, who you probably know from The Sound of Music. They stayed at the hotel several times. They rented out 7 adjoining rooms for their large-sized family and gave interviews to the Journal out of their hotel suite. On the bottom left, you may know this name or you may not, Duty Flint. He's largely been lost to history, I find, but he has a fascinating Rhode Island story that I hope I've done a little bit of justice to in my book, of his rise and fall from sort of being rags to riches story, but a colossal failure in the end financially. You know Buddy Cianci, I'm sure. He was new to me in 2018, but I know everyone else has known him for a very long time. He is a fascinating Biltmore character, let alone his own fascinating character. But you probably or may know that he lived at the Biltmore after and during and up until he went to prison. So during his trial until he went to prison. So the Biltmore was a big part of his story as well. And a lot of these other characters, you obviously might recognize the young Rolling Stones, a young Ronald Reagan, Babe Ruth, JFK. All of these folks make up the fabric of the story of this hotel. And I've been really excited to try to weave their story into my story, while also giving some good historical context. I do think that the story of the Biltmore is very much a story of American history. It's followed the arc of the American economy, and it's followed the arc of American history. It's also a Rhode Island story. It's followed the arc of Rhode Island's history as well. So I've tried to weave all of that together as best I could. So Meet Me at the Biltmore began, as I said, as a research project in my car. The very first article that I ever read about the Biltmore was this very tiny snippet from the New York Times. And actually, I was able to read this before I even got in my car and sat in the CCRI parking lot, because I was able to access the New York Times online. This article is from July 1921. It is not the first article ever published about the hotel, but it was the first one that I found, and it was one of the very, very early articles published about the hotel outside of the Providence Journal. The reason that I find this article so fascinating, again, it's in the New York Times, which in and of itself raised quite a few questions for me. It's about a hot rivet being dropped by a welder from the top of the Biltmore construction site, ripping through the top of a cloth-topped jitney cab, hitting the driver, injuring the driver, and injuring his passenger. That's it. That's the whole article. A welder dropped a rivet. It fell off of this hotel. It damaged somebody's car, and it sent him and his passenger to the hospital. The reason that I found this fascinating was because it actually posed more questions to me than answered anything. First of all, for me, again, not being a Rhode Island native, I thought to myself, why was the New York Times in 1921 covering a story about an accident that happened in Providence, Rhode Island? And why was the New York Times interested in what was going on at the construction of this hotel? I knew, because as a history major, I knew that the early 20s was a time of great amount of construction. There was a lot going on in America. There were railroad lines crisscrossing the nation. I knew that a lot of hotels were probably being built, but it did seem odd to me that the New York Times, of all papers, would be covering this. So I thought to myself, well, that's where my story starts. I have to find out why people were interested in Providence. Why was this hotel being built, and why did people care about it? That led me to first dive into where Rhode Island was at the time that the hotel was built. And I'm going to read a little passage from my book. It's actually the second page of my book, so very early on, just to give you a sense of what I found out. And some of this may not be news to you all, but I thought it was incredibly fascinating. And I hope this picture is a good illustration to as a backdrop to this paragraph. The early 20th century had witnessed extensive expansion and consolidation of America's railway system, with new lines connecting once distant cities and towns. As shipping by rail increased the efficiency and affordability of commerce, and as more convenient travel between cities became commonplace, urban centers like Providence boomed. Providence, already leading in shipping and trade thanks to its position along a complex system of rivers, ports, and waterways, was easily positioned to leverage the new industrial advances. In the decades immediately following the Civil War, Rhode Island's economy had tripled. The textile and metal industries flourished, increasing their output and advancing their technological skill. Complex mill campuses were rapidly built and updated all around the city and state. William McLaughlin writes in his History of the State that Rhode Island's humming mills and belching factories turned out such technically skilled work that at last it was able to enter the world market in competition with British and other European manufacturers. If the United States in those years finally achieved international status as a world power, as a manufacturing nation, shouldering its way into every market around the world, as well as meeting the enormous needs of its own expanding empire, Rhode Island was not playing its part, but it was at the forefront. Rhode Island was not only playing its part, but was at the forefront. So I hope that is illustrative of why the Biltmore was being built suddenly in this booming industrial center of Providence. What I went on to find was that there really weren't too many places in Providence, and actually in Rhode Island and most of the surrounding region, that housed a hotel of the stature of the Biltmore for its time. What I wanted to understand, because when I had initially started my research, I knew that the hotel had been designed by Warren and Wetmore, who were New York Vanderbilt family architects. They designed Grand Central Station in New York, a number of the Vanderbilt homes. So again, why Providence? Why were these architects here? What I was able to find is that while Rhode Island was a booming city, and I wanted to show you this brief clip from the Historical Society of some footage of downtown Providence right before the Biltmore was built. I might just skip the first few seconds here. So Providence had financial institutions, banks, vaudeville theaters, opera houses, Brown University, obviously, the largest shipping port in the country at the time, the most active. What it didn't have was luxury accommodations. So people were coming to Providence to do business. They were coming to the mills, the factories. They were coming to downtown Providence to exchange goods, to sell jewelry, to sell precious metals, they were selling everything from Corliss to Gorham. The painkiller was patented here. I mean, there was pretty much, if it was on the market those days, it was being made in Providence. And this is what downtown Providence looked like. This is just a video of folks outside of a department store. Certainly a lot more hustle and bustle than we're used to seeing in the city now. But it didn't have a luxury hotel. The Narragansett Hotel downtown was by no means luxury for its time, although it was quite large. But it did not measure up to the hotels in New York and Boston. In New York and in Boston, as well as Washington, D.C., luxury hotels were being built at a very rapid pace. And what those hotels were really able to do were to house people coming from all over the country on these intricate rail lines. They were able to house them, their families. They were able to provide really fancy accommodations, as well as meeting spaces, places for people to, they were called sample rooms. People could come and show their wares, and businessmen could come. Essentially, WeWork spaces, the way we think of them now, co-working spaces. People could come and work for multiple weeks at a time, and then they could get back on a train and leave. Providence, though, was experiencing what you see in this picture. People were coming into the city, and then they were quickly getting back on a train and going and staying in luxury accommodations elsewhere. Often they'd come in from New York in the morning, and then they'd leave to go back to New York, even if they weren't from New York, because that was the place to stay in fancy hotels. Well, this wasn't going to work for the businessmen in Providence, and by 1919, a number of theater owners, one of them being Edward Albee, wrote a letter to the mayor, and they essentially said, we will pay for a hotel, but you need to build it. You need to find the land, and you need to build a luxury hotel. We're getting we're losing so much business on our restaurants and our vaudeville theaters and our opera houses because no one is staying in the city that has any money. They're not staying here long enough to utilize these great resources we have. So this is an example of an article. This is from June 1919, when one of the theater owners offered to pay $25,000 out of his own pocket to help finance a luxury hotel in downtown Providence. The Chamber of Commerce took the bait, and they agreed that they needed to find a world-class hotel manager to run a new luxury hotel in Providence. A number of hotel managers were sought out and interviewed and wined and dined and brought to Providence from all over the country. And this man, John McEntee Bowman, won out. John Bowman had just recently built the New York Biltmore Hotel. The hotel itself takes its name from the Vanderbilt estate in Asheville, the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina. And the Vanderbilt family was one of the first early investors of New York Biltmore. So when John here took over management of that hotel, he started the Biltmore Hotel Corporation, and that is how our Biltmore in Providence became part of the Biltmore brand. So John won the bid. He put up a lot of his own money. He hired a partner, Lou Wallach, and they set about to raise the funds to build the Biltmore Hotel. The Biltmore Hotel was one of the very first hotels in the world to be built with a public financing campaign. For about 18 months after the hotel bid was secured and they knew that John Bowman was going to lead at the helm, the Chamber of Commerce ran a public financing campaign where people were asked to buy shares in the new Providence luxury hotel. This is an example of an advertisement that was run in 1921 in the newspaper. It essentially tells people that they should be doing this, buying shares and investing their personal money for the good of their city. There were ads like this. There were dozens of ads every week in the paper about why people should invest in the new hotel. And everybody who was anybody bought part of this hotel. There were even competitions. The outlet company, of course, the outlet company, the longtime department store in Providence, had a competition that the first baby born on the first day of the hotel's opening would be named after the hotel, which was obviously didn't happen necessarily, but they claim that Biltmore became the baby's first, for baby's middle name. There were all sorts of competitions. They sold elevator rides, even though the elevator hadn't been built yet. For $100 a piece, you could buy a ride up the new elevator, and that was a lot of money in 1920. So there were all sorts of gimmicks, all sorts of ways to get people to contribute. In the end, about $2.5 million were raised from the city's denizens, and the other $2.5 million needed for construction was contributed from a number of businessmen in New York, as well as John Bowman and Lou Wallach themselves. And at last, construction started on the Biltmore, which you can see here in 1921 starting to go up. The Biltmore itself was designed to be fireproof in the terms of the day. And it was going to be and designed to be the most modern structure in the world as far as Warren and Wetmore, the architects, were concerned. It had every technological advancement of the day that it possibly could have. It even had different elevators in different places in the building that were of all different sizes to accommodate all different departments. Anything that needed to be done in the hotel had its own office in the hotel. There was a carpentry workshop, a fabric and upholstery workshop, bakeries, all sorts of things. And then finally, in 1922, in the spring of 1922, the hotel was opened. 2,000 people were invited to the opening night. It was by invite only. They came from all over the country. Most of them were associated in some way with either finance, hotels, the railway, distilleries, even though it was at that time now prohibition. Didn't seem to really stop anybody to invite all of the whiskey makers in America. And certainly food and beverage purveyors who wanted to bid on contracts with this new hotel. On the opening day, the Hotel World, which was the big industry magazine at the time, said that the Providence Biltmore was the most luxurious, most modern, and most fireproof hotel that had ever been built. The fireproof thing comes up a lot because at the time, a lot of places were burning down. So it was extremely important for folks to know that their hotel was not going to light a blaze in the middle of the night. When it opened, the lobby of the hotel was adorned with Egyptian fabrics. It had palms brought in from the Caribbean. There was gold plates in the ceiling. I mean, it was really the most lavish and luxurious hotel that many people had ever seen, even beating out the Waldorf Astoria, the Plaza, and some of the others in New York. And John Bowman knew those hotels well. He was a hotel man from New York, so he did everything he could to beat those hotels out. And it was a huge success. The Biltmore very quickly became the center of the Providence world. Everything from dinners to parties to talks to debutante balls to political functions, everything happened at the Biltmore. This gentleman is Dwayne Wallach. He's Lou Wallach's son. He was the manager of the Biltmore for its first 25 years. He had a lot of really wild ideas, but the first really wild idea that that drew a lot of attention was the fact that he was one of the first hotels in the country to have a farm on the roof to provide eggs and flowers and dairy products and herbs to the hotel right from the hotel's roof. As you can see in the background, all of those factories and air pollution, I'm not sure how fresh those goods would have been, but at the time it was considered a very innovative approach, what we would now call farm to table. So this is Dwayne with his chickens on the roof. There were some problems with this, obviously. Chickens can fly, so they didn't always stick around. They had some geese that migrated south at one point, which was really problematic for all of the geese dinners that they were preparing that night. But all in all, a pretty successful innovation for Dwayne. When the farm idea got a little bit old, he actually turned this into a zoo and had monkeys and bears and alligators. And that lasted until a little bit into the Great Depression, when I think feeding monkeys became less of a priority. Pictured here, you'll see one of the big events of the 1920s at the hotel. This was the reception for Charles Lindbergh when he landed at Quonset and Quonset Field, because there was no airport at the time. He was actually on a tour throughout the United States promoting commercial airlines and commercial air travel and trying to get states to build commercial airfields. And he was one of the big proponents of what would become TF Green Airport. You can also see right across in this photo, Union Station, which was the primary train station for the region. The hotel was built adjacent to Union Station very intentionally so that people would not have to take taxis to the hotel, because automobile traffic was considered really faux pas, particularly for wealthy people. So you can see how close that train station would have been at the time. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, lots of people also lived at the Biltmore. So as time went on, one of the big revenue generating sources for the hotel, especially in the 1930s, was renting out suites at the hotel as apartments. This was very, very common across all hotels in the country at the time. It was very posh. It also really cut down on the amount of people you needed to employ at your house, because all of the housemaids and servants and cooks came with the hotel. So you could really cut down on your costs. And that was really important, particularly in the 1930s. I did spend a lot of time researching the residents and people who lived in the hotel, because I find their stories very fascinating. This story in particular stood out to me, and Henrietta Gibson gets her own chapter in the book. She was a wealthy recluse who lived at the hotel up until the end of her life, but she was probably, and Rachel on this call even filled me in even more on this recently, because she has some connections to the Gibson family, Wolf family and Gibson family, but Henrietta was one of the most gossiped about women in Providence of her time. She married a millionaire on his deathbed, and he literally left her his entire estate, which was immediately contested in court by his other family members since she had married him 3 days before he died. She had quite a bit of gossip around her, but she lived a very, very sad life toward the end of her life and did become a recluse at the hotel. I really enjoyed researching characters like Henrietta. Again, she does get a whole chapter in my book because of great articles like this, where before the millionaire that she married died, they believed that them being in love had lifted him from his illness and saved his life. Well, that's not true. About a day after this was printed, he died. But there were so many great historic articles that just wove these fascinating stories, and I tried again to get all of that into a book without the book being 1,000 pages long. But there are so many great characters, with Henrietta being one of them. The hotel endured a lot over the century, not just people, but this was a picture of the Great Flood or the hurricane of 1938, which resulted in incredible flooding. And then again, there was another hurricane in 1954. The Biltmore was devastated by both hurricanes. The 1938 hurricane blew out all the windows in the ballroom, knocked out the power for weeks downtown. And the hotel remained occupied during that time, but it had no power, it had no heat, and it had 7 feet of water in the lobby. So it was incredibly damaged, as were so many structures throughout the state, obviously with whole towns being washed away. Then in 1947, the hotel changed hands for the first time since it had been built, and it was bought by this little tiny company called the Sheraton Company. At the time, they only had a few dozen holdings. They were a pretty small outfit out of Boston. And they bought the Biltmore. It was their second hotel in Providence, and they did everything they could to modernize it. Sheraton was at the time the most modernized and commercialized hotel chain, and they continued to be so until well into the 80s. They had the first 1-800 number. They were the first to allow people to make their own reservations. It was an incredible change from that old world, Gilded Age, really white glove, hands-on service of luxury hotels. The Sheraton really made the Biltmore much more what many of us probably remember the hotel to be, because Sheraton owned it all the way up until the 70s. But with that, they put a lot of effort into making it a destination hotel for lots of different reasons. They upgraded the restaurants, they upgraded the ballrooms, and they built the Bacchante Lounge, which was a very, very famous lounge in the Biltmore. JFK would drink there with his Navy buddies when he was stationed in Melville. Frank Sinatra played here before anyone knew who Frank Sinatra was, right at that very piano. There were just so many celebrities in and out of the Bacchante Lounge. It was particularly famous for being a little bit scandalous, or at the time, very scandalous. The Bacchante waitresses were known for their very risque outfits. And when Sheraton actually tried to make this more conservative, they had the Bacchante Lounge Bacchante girls, as they were called, dressed like this for about 10 years. And then they tried to take away the diaphanous nature of the skirts and have them wear longer skirts. They received hundreds of letters of angry male patrons, not just from Providence, but from all over the country, saying that they would never come to the hotel again if they didn't give them back the short skirts for the Bacchante girls. So that is how bizarre, perhaps, and inappropriate probably by today's standards, but also popular the Bacchante girls were at the time. The hotel really treated the Bacchante girls incredibly well. They got their hair done at the salon every day. They were given taxis home every single night by the hotel. So to be a Bacchante girl was quite an honor at the time. Sheraton held the hotel for a long time. They were also known, of course, for a TV show that went on for almost 12 years called Breakfast at the Biltmore. It was a live breakfast show in the hotel that took place in the Garden Room, now the Capitol Ballroom. They did all sorts of things to, again, try to follow the times, including putting up the famous neon Biltmore sign on the roof. At the time, it said Sheraton on one side and Biltmore on the other. Now it says Biltmore on both sides. Then in the 1970s, they had to sell. The Sheraton Corporation changed hands several times. They sold a lot of their older hotels. A small company called Gotham Hotels bought the Biltmore and very quickly drove it into the ground. So the Biltmore closed very, very abruptly. They did not even tell their tenants they were closing. They just turned off the lights and the heat, and the few remaining people who actually still lived at the hotel just sort of wandered out onto the street with their belongings. And it was, as you can see by this headline, abrupt Biltmore closing shocks its tenants. It was very, very upsetting. It was very particularly upsetting for this gentleman who had just become mayor of the city and really loved the Biltmore. He particularly loved drinking at the Biltmore and was very, very sad that it had closed. He made it his personal charge to get the hotel reopened. Buddy, this is obviously Buddy Cianci. I don't know if I need to say his name to this group, but Buddy formed a group called the 21st Providence Group, made up of Michael Metcalf, Bruce Sundlin, Buddy, a number of people from a couple of the other big corporations in town, and they set about to work to revitalize the Biltmore along with a couple of the other historic buildings in town. And they were successful. They got huge amounts of federal and state money to revamp the hotel and pull it out of closure. The hotel reopened in 1978. With Alan Tremaine of the Copley Plaza in Boston, helping to reopen it and redesign it. And that went really well until, the late 80s and 90s, when all of Providence went into decline. This is sort of a funny slide. Buddy had this sign put up on the side of the hotel. It says, "The safest city in the continental United States." That was definitely not true, but I guess, you can just put up a sign and you can sort of hope that people will believe you. It wasn't true. Providence wasn't very safe, and it had a real problem with petty crime, with prostitution, and with drugs, not to mention the Federal Hill contingent that wasn't making things particularly peaceful in the city. So Providence really needed a facelift. That came in the 90s with Omni Hotels for the Providence Biltmore Hotel. Omni renovated the inside. I forgot to mention at the previous slide that when it had reopened, they had put in the glass elevator, but they had tore out the staircase. This was a big deal for people in Providence who used to say, "Meet me at the Biltmore stairs." There were no more stairs, so you couldn't meet anyone there anymore. Omni came in and gave the hotel a facelift. They rebuilt the grand staircase around the glass elevator, and they really turned it into a combination of sort of that 90s motif hotel, but with some restoration to the Art Deco nature. This leads us into the 21st century, where the Providence Biltmore is today. Hundreds of thousands of people have stayed at this hotel over time. Everyone has an incredible story about something wild that happened at this hotel. I think this lobby is totally iconic in the minds and hearts of people who have lived and worked and celebrated in Rhode Island. And now it has taken on a new identity as the Graduate Providence. The Graduate Hotel company is owned by AJ Capital Partners in Chicago, but they have really doubled down on their investment in making sure that historic hotels are kept unique, that they are not standardized, that everything within the hotel is very Providence and Rhode Island centric. And they have kept that commitment even through the pandemic, when they had to close for 18 months. So I will say that the Biltmore Hotel's future looks really bright as of right now. I think that AJ Capital Partners seems to be, at least with my interviews with them, very committed to the hotel and to their other hotels around the country. And I think that we are fortunate that the Providence Biltmore will continue to be saved. We'll continue to hopefully have a few more decades, if not another 100 years in Providence and beyond. And we're lucky to have such an incredible historic, iconic landmark still available to us so that we can go and relive those wonderful days of the 1920s when the Chamber of Commerce and John Bowman envisioned the most modern and luxurious hotel in the world. And that is my presentation. I will stop sharing so we could chat a little bit while looking at each other.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Very good. Very nice.
So interesting, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I could talk about it for hours and hours, so I hope you'll read the book, and we can continue the conversation anytime.
Okay.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Good night.
to meet
Bye.
you.